Andrew Jackson, the early years, and we're going to talk about Andrew Jackson the man, kind of tell you about him so you know a little bit about him. Very interesting person, one of my favorite presidents, not because necessarily he was very good, but he had a great spunk about him. Okay, Andrew Jackson was born on the Carolina frontier in 1767, keeping in mind that we didn't have states at that time, and so it was the frontier. He was born on the Carolina frontier in 1767, which could be kind of a combination of both North and South Carolina. Okay, that was frontier land in those days. And he was born the son of immigrant parents who came to America from Northern Ireland. Okay, so Andrew Jackson was born on the Carolina frontier in 1767. He was the son of immigrant parents from Northern Ireland. We all came from somewhere to get to America, our descendants. His came from Northern Ireland. Now, you got to remember this was 1767, so Andrew Jackson really grew up with no formal schooling whatsoever. And during his early life, he was made fun of a lot because he couldn't spell, and he wore really odd backwood clothing. So he was kind of a hillbilly, I guess would be the best way to put it. He grew up with no formal schooling, and during his early life, he was made fun of because he could not spell, and he wore really odd backwoods clothing. Kind of what you might think is a hillbilly in today's realm. Well, in 1781, during the Revolutionary War, Andrew Jackson was just 14 years old. And you might remember this from one of our videos. Anybody remember what happened to Andrew Jackson during the Revolutionary War when he was just 14? Anybody pick that up when we watched the video on the Revolutionary War? Just a small excerpt. During that time, British soldiers stormed a cabin where he and his older brother were trying to hide. So during the Revolutionary War, Andrew Jackson and his brother were trying to hide from the British. Why would they want to hide from the British, do you think? Why would they have an issue with the British other than the fact they were colonists? I mean, why would they want to hide from the British? His 14-year-old boy and his older brother, who's not much older than him. Good guess, not to have to serve. What? They had a role with the Continental Army. They were couriers. What are couriers? People that send messages. They would send message from one camp to another. Nobody would suspect them because they were so young. And so the British were there to get them because they were serving as couriers. And when the boys were caught, they were captured and were going to be taken. So the British soldiers stormed a cabin where Jackson and his older brother tried to hide. And the two boys were taken prisoner because they were serving as couriers for the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. They were passing messages. Well, Andrew Jackson was kind of a sassy kid. And one of the British officers ordered him to clean my boots. He ordered the 14-year-old Jackson, clean my boots. And this made Jackson very angry. He had a kind of a quick fuse, quick temper. So as these British soldiers are taking possession of these two boys for serving as couriers during the Revolutionary War, one of the British officers demands that the younger Jackson, Andrew Jackson, quote, clean my boots. And this made Jackson very angry. And he replies, I am a prisoner of war and demand to be treated accordingly. So Jackson kind of in a way smarts off to this British officer, orders him to clean his boots. And he said, I am a prisoner of war and demand to be treated accordingly. Well, the British officer became so enraged with his back talk that he actually took a swipe at Jackson with his sword. Took a swipe at Jackson with his sword. A swipe at Jackson with his sword. So kiddos, I've got my sword here. And I'm going to take a swipe at Andrew. Or Andrew.
I would die.
Yeah, what did Andrew not do there? I would have chopped his head right off. What would be your natural reaction if I took a swipe at you? What would you do? What would be the... Well, or what might you do to, you put your hand out.
No.
He put his hand out. Jackson put his hand out, and when he put his hand out, he cut the boy's hand and also, probably saved his life, he hit the scalp of his head a little bit and left a crease there. So he takes a swipe at the young Jackson. He tries to block it with his hand. The sword cuts his hand, and part of the sword hits his scalp and cuts his scalp, leaving a scar for the remainder of his life. Do you remember the guy talking about that in the video at all? Remember, whenever he would start to think, he would sit there and rub that scar on his head, and then it just made him hate the British more and more and more, which motivated him in the War of 1812. Okay? Well, anyway, carrying on, the two boys were taken to a British prisoner of war camp, and they both contracted smallpox while they were there. So both boys were taken to a British prison camp, and at that prison camp they both contracted smallpox. You had an opportunity to see what those ships were like, we talked about, when they took those prisoners of war and how disgusting the conditions were. Many of those probably contracted smallpox as well, but the two Jackson boys contracted smallpox. And they both probably would have died there if it was not for their widowed mother, Elizabeth Jackson. They probably would have died in that prison camp if it wasn't for their widowed mother, Elizabeth Jackson. She had already had some bad luck. Her husband had been killed in a logging accident, and her oldest son was killed fighting in the Revolutionary War. So she had already lost her husband and her oldest son and did not want to lose her other two boys. And so she made an attempt to go to the prison camp and try to talk the British officer there into letting her sons go. So Elizabeth's husband had been killed in a logging accident, and her eldest son was killed fighting in the Revolutionary War, and so she made an effort to try to save her other two boys, and she went to the prison camp and pled with the British officer to let her out, in which he eventually did, partly because of their young age. So Elizabeth goes to the British prison camp, pleads with the British officer in charge to let her boys go, and he does partly because of their age. What was the rumor reason why she let them go? Why let them go? Figure it out. Well, she supposedly, and that was something that Andrew Jackson had to live with, that maybe his mother did some other things to get him out, but she was desperate. Okay? That was the rumor, but nobody really confirmed that historically, but he had to live with that. As they left the prison camp, both boys were in grave condition, and Elizabeth only had one horse. As they left the prison camp, both boys were in grave condition with smallpox, but she only had one horse. So, she was going to lead the horse, and one of the boys was going to ride the horse, and one was going to walk. Which one do you think would ride? Well, just not names, but the one that was in the worst condition, which happened to be the older brother. Okay? So Mrs. Jackson and Andrew got the older brother up on the horse. She led the horse, and with smallpox, Andrew Jackson walked back home to the Carolinas, which was 40 miles away. So as they left that British prison camp, because she only had one horse, she made the decision that the sickest son, the oldest son, would ride the horse, she would walk the horse, lead the horse, and Andrew Jackson, with smallpox, would be on foot, and they walked 40 miles back to their home in the Carolinas. What happened by the time they arrived home? The older boy died. The older boy had died. And for the next 6 months, Elizabeth Jackson struggled to keep Andrew alive. So by the time they got back to the Carolinas, the older boy had died. And for the next 6 months, Elizabeth Jackson struggled to keep Andrew alive. But she succeeded. What was her reward for her efforts for her sons? Unfortunately, 6 months after that, his mother died of cholera. which is on your ID sheet. Cholera. Now, anybody know what cholera is? What is it?
Isn't it like drinking water?
And what does that do to you? I'm going to tell you, and this is gross, but this is what she died of. Cholera is an acute illness caused by infection of the intestine. An estimated 3 to 5 million cases and over 100,000 deaths occur each year around the world. The infection is often mild or without symptoms, but can sometimes be severe. Approximately 1 in 10 affected persons will have severe disease characterized by profuse watery diarrhea, vomiting, and leg cramps. In these people, rapid loss of body fluids leads to dehydration and shock. Without treatment, death can occur within hours. So she dies of cholera 6 months after she saves her son. Well, Andrew Jackson becomes an orphan, and he's taken in by relatives. Andrew Jackson becomes an orphan, and he's taken in by relatives. And before she died, she urged her youngest son to become a minister. Okay? Before she died, she urged her youngest son to become a minister. So relatives will take over his life, and he will be raised by relatives. He becomes an orphan, and his mother wants him to be a minister. However, during his teenage years, he was more of a hellion than anything else. He was always taking part in fighting, cursing, drinking, smoking and chewing tobacco. He was not making a very good run at being a minister. Okay? He was kind of a hellion as a teenager. He always was taking part in fighting, cursing, drinking, and smoking tobacco. He had no interest in education or any type of vocational job, so he earned his money by gambling on horse races and dice games. Okay? So he wasn't interested in getting an education. He didn't really want to study to be a vocation, to have a vocation. So he earned a living, so to speak, by gambling on horse races and dice games. So he was not a real positive influence on himself in the teenage years. A hellion, fighting, cursing, drinking, smoking and chewing tobacco. Has no interest in education or any type of vocation, and he earns any money that he gets by gambling in horse races and dice games. Well, at the end of his teenage years, before he got into his 20s, he realized that his life had to change. And he made the decision to better himself, and he wanted more out of life. He kind of went through the process of hellion, figured out it wasn't getting him anywhere, and decided in his late teens that he better make something out of himself or it was going to be a long life. So he leaves the frontier, the Carolina frontier, and he moves east with the hopes of becoming a lawyer. Kind of a high standard, wouldn't it? When so far what I told you, you're thinking, I wonder how that's going to work. Okay? But he decides he's going to clean himself up. He leaves the frontier and moves east with the hopes of becoming a lawyer. And he ends up in North Carolina, where he begins to study law under a very famous attorney by the name of Spruce McKay. So he decides to get his act together in his late teens. He wants to make something out of himself. He leaves the Carolina frontier. He moves east, ends up in North Carolina, and begins to study law under a very, very famous attorney, Spruce McKay. Well, Jackson had really made a change. He listened to attorney Spruce McKay. He read the attorney's law library in detail. Even though he wasn't an educated man, he taught himself. And he spent endless hours listening to Spruce McKay and also read the attorney's law library in detail. And he basically learned the legal process itself. You know, preparing wills, legal contracts. He learned how to be a lawyer by mentoring underneath this Spruce McKay. And he studied with him for 3 years. And at the age of 20, he finally had gained the respect for himself that he believed he needed. So he studies with Spruce McKay for nearly 3 years, and at the age of 20, finally gains that respect for himself that he so desperately needed. He was no longer the backwoods frontier boy. He now was a polished man, and he was being accepted by upper class people in North Carolina. They knew very little of his past, only knew of what successes he had accomplished under Spruce McKay. So he's turned the corner, turned the corner. Well, after studying for Spruce McKay for 3 years, at the age of 20, in 1788, he moves to Nashville, Tennessee to practice law. So after he gets polished under the tutelage of Spruce McKay, in 1788, Jackson moves to Nashville, Tennessee, and starts to practice law. Now, he was a very hard-working person, and because of his hard work, at the age of 21, he was made a prosecutor in Nashville. What's a prosecutor? We know what a prosecutor is? You generally don't want to stand in court and have to face one. What's a prosecutor? So, Sully gets in trouble for something which she never would because the angel halo over her head is much larger than most. Anyway, she gets accused of a crime and she goes to trial. Who's the prosecutor? Well, not so much accused, but the person that's going to try to prove to the jury that you're guilty of whatever you did. He's prosecuting you, he or she. The defense attorney is defending you. So a prosecutor is someone that goes in and tries to prosecute someone for violation of law. It's good stuff. It's a pretty high position. Okay? Well, his appointment as a prosecutor at the age of 21 did not set well with other attorneys who had more experience, and they scoffed at Jackson's opportunity. Made, light of him. Well, what's he doing there? He hasn't got any experience. How do you get that job? A little bit of jealousy came up. So these other attorneys that had more experience than Jackson scoffed at Jackson, didn't think he had the right to be a prosecutor at such a young age because he had no experience. They were, again, fairly jealous. Well, one attorney by the name of Wait Still Avery went a little too far. Wait Still Avery went a little too far in his criticism of Andrew Jackson for lack of experience. And he insulted him. He insulted Jackson. And Jackson had a what? Quick temper. So what did he do? You dang right, when Wayne Still Avery insulted him about his lack of experience, Jackson lost his temper and immediately challenged Avery to a duel. Now, this came from his mother. His mother was a fiery gal, and she always preached to her children not to tell lies and don't accept slander. Don't sue for slander, call him out on a duel. So she was kind of a tough woman, and he had learned that philosophy, that you're not going to tell lies, you're not going to accept slander. You don't sue somebody for slander, you challenge him to a duel. So he does. Now, both men showed up for the duel, but both figured out it wasn't such a great idea. So what did they do to save their honor? They agreed to avoid direct shots. I'm not sure if they shot in the air or shot which way, but they agreed to avoid direct shots at each other. That way they both would save their honor because neither really wanted to die. Okay? So when they took their respective paces apart and turned to fire, both men fired their weapon into the air. I don't know if it was straight up or which way, but they fired their weapons into the air, and the duel was over. That would be the first of many duels Andrew Jackson would get himself involved in. Now, the good thing about this decision by Andrew Jackson was probably the first time in his life that he ever controlled his emotions and controlled his temper. Okay? Normally he wouldn't be that way. But anyway, that's the first duel. Backing up a little bit, when Jackson first moved to Nashville, Tennessee, he rented a room in a boarding home. Now, have you ever seen those? They have those where Lee Harvey Oswald did the same thing. He rented a room in a boarding house during the time that he had assassinated President Kennedy. Well, Andrew Jackson got to Nashville, Tennessee, and he rented a room in a boarding house. This is where someone would have a big home and they would rent out the rooms for so much a week or whatever. Well, soon after he rented this room in the boarding house, he fell in love with Rachel Donaldson Robards. And she was the daughter of the woman who owned the boarding house. So soon after he moved into that boarding house, he fell in love with Rachel Donaldson Robards, who was the daughter of the woman who owned the boarding house. How convenient, right? She was a very attractive young lady. She was very well educated, and she spoke her mind, which Jackson admired. In those days, it was a little unusual for a woman to speak their mind. Their job was to, stay back and not be heard from. And Jackson really respected her because she spoke her mind. Other than the fact that she was attractive in his mind and well educated. He was everything he was looking for in a woman. Well educated, good looking, spoke her mind. But the relationship between Jackson and Rachel Donaldson Robards became an issue immediately. Became an issue because she was married. She was married.
No.
Okay? So their relationship became an issue immediately because she was a married woman. Now, she was in a very bad marriage. Her husband was very verbally abusive and probably physically abusive as well. Who knows? But he definitely was verbally abusive. She was in a really bad marriage. And she had realized that she married the wrong man. However, what happened in those days, and I guess it happens kind of in these days, depending on your philosophy. What'd you do in those days if you married the wrong man and were in a bad marriage? Nope. You sucked it up. You made the decision, you suck it up and you live with it. Hope it gets better. That was kind of the philosophy in those days. And to be honest with you, it's an issue in 2017 where women are abused and they stay in the marriage. And people go, what? Stay in the relationship. There's lots of reasons why people do things. But in those days, even though she had realized that she had married the wrong man, you had to live with the bad